Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson, a World Alternative Media here, and of course we're joined by author and economic analyst here at WAM, John Sneisen, and there's a lot to go into regarding Turkey. As many of you might know, I was recently in Turkey, and myself and a few other people, we rented a car, we drove across the country, we ended up around the Syrian border, and it's just an amazing country. It's a beautiful country, but there are a lot of problems that are hidden, that are painted over, I guess you could say, with a thin veneer of paint, when the reality is, no matter the fact that the infrastructure is better than almost any country I've ever seen before, the economy is not actually doing well. And we remember quite a few years ago what happened when the economy was hit by a multitude of reasons, including Trump tweeting the Turkish lira, from about 2 lira to $1 to about 5.6 to $1. And that had to do with many things, not just Trump tweeting, but that's one of the things that led to what happened in the Turkish economy, as well as lots of sanctions and out of control central planning. The amount of printing, the amount of manipulation in that market is over the top, folks. And I saw this firsthand watching jungles of skyscrapers, jungles of high-rise apartment buildings being built. And I'm going to play a clip before we get back to the story that we're about to get into right away. I want you guys to check out this video that I shot while driving across the countryside in Turkey.
I honestly find it amazing. I don't know how long it's going to take until people around this area see, wow, my city's building and growing and constantly on the move, but you just see these apartment buildings everywhere, and obviously you see that some of them look like they're 60 stories high. I mean, and they're just piling people into there and trying to make the most of every little piece of land and trying to make low-income housing, all that kind of stuff, to pile people into these big cities. And the fact of the matter is, it's a massive housing bubble, and it's a ticking time bomb. Obviously, the economy in Turkey has been in bad shape for a long time. This is just a sign of it. It's worse than ever. They're trying to prop up their GDP. They're trying to make their housing market look attractive to investors. It's basically one of the worst, most riskiest forms of speculation you can imagine. And it's going to end very badly for everyone here. And it's very sad to watch because it's just right in front of us. The proof is in the pudding, guys. There's millions and millions and millions of buildings, it seems, in this country that they just keep building. I don't know how much longer it's going to last, but by the looks of it, probably not all that long.
So there was out of control building happening there, and it got to the point where just all these high rises being built left and right. It told me that it was obviously, even though the veneer is, wow, this is a great economy, everything's doing great, you could barely see any homeless people around, there is a huge amount of focus by the Turkish government in propping things up and making things look nice when the reality isn't so great, and it's going to come down eventually. But I wanted to get into this news regarding China and Turkey because, look, the ceasefire happened, all is well, right? Well, there's a little bit more going on than meets the eye in Turkey, and I wanted to get into this article out of Zero Hedge, which says China's $3.6 billion bailout insulates Turkey from U.S. And as the article goes into, Beijing's biggest support package ever for President Erdogan arrives at a critical time. Despite the U.S. threat to obliterate and destroy Turkey's economy, the Turkish lira and Turkish interest rates barely have budged in the past week. Turkish stocks, especially banks, are down sharply, in part due to the U.S. criminal charges against Halkbank for aiding Iran sanctions violations. That is remarkable given the fragility of Turkey's currency earlier in 2019. Between February and May, the Turkish lira fell from 5.2 to the US dollar to 6.2 in response to US sanctions, before recovering to 5.88 to the dollar today. The Turkish central bank leaned on Turkish banks to refrain from offering liquidity in short sellers, but Turkish money markets remained orderly. What changed is China. Turkish President Erdogan's insolence in the face of American threats bring to mind Brer Rabbit's imprecation to Brer Fox. Please don't throw me in the briar patch. The relevant foliage in this case is bamboo. I have absolutely no idea what that means, folks. I don't get that reference, so please comment below what that means and help me out here. But anyway, carrying on. Bloomberg News reported August 9th, China's central bank transferred $1 billion worth of funds to Turkey in June. Beijing's biggest support package ever for President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, delivered at a critical time in an election month. The inflow marks the first time Turkey received such a substantial amount under the lira-yuan swap agreement with Beijing that dates back to 2012, according to a person with direct knowledge of the matter who asked not to be named because the information isn't public. China's direct investment in Turkey also has surged this year, as Nikkei reported August 22nd. China is coming to Turkey's aid during its economic crisis with $3.6 billion in funding for infrastructure projects, leveraging Ankara's conflict with Washington to expand its Belt and Road initiative in the key country that links Asia with Europe. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said August 11th that his country was preparing to trade through national currencies with partners like China, bypassing the US dollar. The US placed additional tariffs on Turkey the next day as a feud simmered over the imprisonment of a US pastor accused of being involved in the 2016 coup attempt against the Turkish leader. The lira then hit about 7 per dollar, a drop of more than 40% since the beginning of the year, spurred by one of the world's economic giants. Erdogan naturally turned to another, China, for much-needed financial backup. American policymakers should have their eyes checked for cataracts. They appear unable to keep the whole of the world map in view. This was eminently predictable. In August 2018, I warned in Asian Times that China will buy Turkey on the cheap, as the article says. China has had its issues with Turkey's volatile and ambitious leader, to be sure. Turkey in the past styled itself the protector of China's Uyghur minority, some 15 million Muslims who speak a dialect of Turkish and live mainly in China's Xinjiang province. China reportedly has incarcerated between 1 and 2 million Uyghurs in re-education camps where they are forced to learn Chinese culture to the detriment of their Islamic identity. Erdogan in the past had accused China of genocide against the Uyghurs. After the Chinese bailout, however, Erdogan declared that the Uyghurs are living happily in China, and that is the reality of government, folks. That's the reality of they don't care about the issues at hand. It's about control and being able to own the public and to be able to have power over the public in other countries. And now, of course, Erdogan has been a fair weather type, leader with countries around the world. He's friends and enemies with basically everyone, and that's just government. That's not a picking on Turkey. That's not picking on Erdogan. That's the reality of government in a nutshell, no matter where you go in the world. But John, let's talk about this. I showed the video of me driving through the countryside in Turkey and the vast amount of central planning, the huge property bubble that's happening there. There's so much money being pumped into the economy, and at face value, it looks great. But there's an impending disaster on the way. Can you go into Turkey's economy a little bit and what you think of this impending disaster that is really connecting to the global bubble that we see everywhere in the world?
Yeah, of course. In Turkey, they're not, getting out of the way of this global bubble happening in debt, and they are probably one of the worst perpetrators. The only one that's worse than Turkey is actually Argentina. That has grown since 2008. Their debt 1,300+%. While Turkey is at 880%. You might ask, like, where China in this? Well, China is 430 something. So China has only grown half of what Turkey has over the last 10 years. And that should wake people up a little bit. And that totally makes sense with all the mass amounts of building of real estate that you saw in Turkey, Josh, and the feeling of kind of wealth, increase of Turkish people, because when it comes to any people around the world, and this is not something that Robert Kiyosaki was or the United States is just prevalent of. It's that most people, the middle class, all that have been created in Turkey by this debt that has been printed, Josh, that comes from the actual that most of them probably has a house that they got into debt to have. And now that house has been going up in value because of all this debt getting pushed into the markets. And that is, of course, a trouble in the making. We've seen, debt, credit bubbles ever since the Chinese created the first fiat currency back in 1024, the Song Dynasty did. We saw a credit bubble back then. We've seen hundreds upon hundreds of credit bubbles around the world since then. So this is not a new thing that is going on in Turkey with the mass printing of currency, of course. I wanted to touch upon some other things that the Turks are doing to kind of mitigate, because we were talking about the hit that they got from the U.S. From Trump, tweeting and so on, because they've been heavily dependent on the United States SWIFT system to do transactions around the world. But they are trying to make trade with people that are in the region, like Iran and like others, which makes sense. You want to trade with local partners. It's way less cost than having to get oil from the United States or other places around the world that's far away, right? So it totally makes sense that Turkey would do that in a sense of, not like, if you remove the government, like, people would trade with each other where it's easiest to get the goods that you need. So of course that is not a new thing, but if you take a look at, for example, another thing that they've been doing, other than, of course, getting bailed out by the Chinese IMF, I could call it the AIIB, the bank that runs the One Belt One Road initiative that is lending out and indebting nations around the world, building infrastructure, which is a little bit better than the United States have done sometimes, where they've just been bombing people instead of building infrastructure. But it's still the actual outcome that will be on the other end of it would be the same, which is total enslavement of those populations, because what's going to happen is the corrupt officials take a lot of that money, run away with it, and then you sit around with all the people has to take on that IMF or AIIB debt to hold it. But they've done another thing to get away from the U.S. hegemon, and since this is interesting, Josh. So since January of 2017, which now we're like 2.5 years away from that, they have almost tripled their gold holdings, Josh. They went from 116 tons up to now 320.69 tons. They've been increasing it every year, except for when they had issues with their currency, like heavy back in January, a little bit earlier than January of 2019, in December to June, the financial crisis that started in 2018. Remember the crash in the United States there with US dollar, like the stock markets was going down. They actually sold off 5 tons at that time. But they've been accumulating, the Turkish government, and of course I hope that the local population in Turkey has been doing the same. Now let's take a look at other things that they might have been doing in Turkey. The population is doing, because Turkey is also known, if you read the book The Curse of Cash, in that book there's statistics that show that of course The Curse of Cash talks about how taxation is the most number one thing that you need to implement in order to stop people from evading taxes.
Theft.
And of course Turkey is theft, exactly. But the best ones at mitigating against the highway robbery that taxation is the Turks. They are actually the best ones in the world, better than the Norwegians, which is actually top 5. You would think that a great country of Norway would not evade taxes. They would pay their taxes to keep their great government programs going.
No, it's called virtue signaling, John. It's called virtue signaling, and I have to explain. It's a very complicated issue in Turkey. Just spending time in Turkey isn't enough. It's just such an extensively difficult system to try and understand. But one thing I do understand, no matter what, is governments and central banks are organized crime syndicates that are there in order to push people into further dependence and to create a massive complex of control over people. They depend on the dependence of the public. That's always how it is, and the more control they have, the better it is, and people on the ground suffer. Pawns sacrificed for the king and the queen, the individuals on the ground. And as I showed earlier, there's all these skyscrapers everywhere holding all these people, and like just massive housing bubble. John, what do you think it says when you have these cities where everyone is moving into these massive skyscrapers? We're not talking about like houses being built in mass. We're talking about a property bubble mostly built on high rises that are 20 to 40 stories tall, and filling every single spare hill that they have with these huge skyscrapers. What do you think of these jungles of buildings that they're building in Turkey, and what it says about their economy?
Well, of course, that shows directly into the 880% increase in debt levels in Turkey, of course, and that debt is not the government debt. It doesn't account for government debt at all. Actually, the government debt is very little compared to the actual private debt in Turkey. but again, it just shows you that people are getting, moving into cities. They're densifying cities, which is a part of the Agenda 2030, because it's easier to control people within the cities, of course, instead of having them on the countryside. But the problem is on the countryside, usually that's where you grow a lot of the food for all the people that you need to feed around the world. And what we kind of forget, Josh, is that we actually, over time, it seems like civilizations, and this plays into, your ancient civilization understanding, Josh, is that ancient civilization, any civilizations around the world, seems to, of course, there's the currency around it. But then after, when you build that currency, you financialize kind of the economy, and there's less and less need for actual people to, produce things of real value, have, real products and so on into the economy. And that is a huge detriment, because people tend to forget that they actually need food, they need water. And then at that time, a lot of times when you financialize it too much, it could become too late to actually recover for the population to feed themselves enough.
Well, John, that's something that plays into something I saw a lot out in Turkey, which is that, and it's really terrifying to think of people moving out of the countryside and into the cities in a place like Turkey that's so dependent on agriculture. Of course, there's cotton fields everywhere. There's melon farms everywhere. There is cashew farms. It's huge. It's a huge contributor to the world supply of cashews, by the way. And there's a lot of migrant pickers that still pick by hand. They don't use the machines as much as many places. And it's all just like, if that is all wiped out, if that agricultural sector, which by the way, Turkey historically, depending on what you believe about the global history and how revisionist it might be, is said to be the area, or ancient Armenia, or whatever you want to call it, was the area that basically invented agriculture in the first place. So when you wipe out the people that are historically the people behind the first examples of agriculture throughout civilization, and you move them all into big cities, and they're dependent on the state, they're dependent on these entities. And what happens when everything goes down? You're begging the government for help, while there's no one that's actually independent enough to grow anything for themselves and feed themselves. That's incredibly dangerous going forward.
Oh, 100% it is, Josh. And it just ties into the problem that any fiat currency creates, is that financialization aspect and credit bubble, because everybody's feeling rich because they, as you said, there's very little homeless people. The problem with that is that, you build an unsustainable future. Second of all, it's no difference in the world. Wherever you travel, there's the middle class, grows upon debt, because it's poor people that can't afford to, get the things that the rich have, but they use debt to get that. To get housing, to get nice cars and so on. It might not be very smart of them to get into all that debt, because it's what they actually call it. I've been doing a report now on consumer on assets in the United States, and it's called consumer durables. But the problem is it doesn't endure that long, and it loses value over time. Even housing does. But the thing is, if it doesn't give you money, cash flow every month, it's not an asset, it's a liability. And that's what people don't understand, is, my house is an asset if I sell it. Well, yeah, sell it then it becomes an asset, but it's not an asset until you actually have physical positive cash flow or positive capital gains coming from that asset. So again, it's a false belief that, this enrichment that, you feel from all this debt flowing into the economy, you'll feel very, rich, because my house is going up every year. I'm using it as an ATM. It's probably the same in Turkey as well. I don't think that Turkey is too much different than the rest of the world when it comes to that, because it's quite highly addictive. It's one of those, it's an opioid, it's like the Oxycontin crisis, or meth crisis. When you're hooked on it, it's hard to get off of it, because, and then of course it's, becomes harder and harder and more expensive to get over time as you get too much of it. And then of course you go bankrupt after a while when you take, I call it a financial overdose of debt heroin. And that's where, the Turkish are definitely on their way to. They're way farther than, Canada, that has 100% growth in debt,
John,
and US that have 54.
The thing is, I mean, with Turkey, and again, it's a very complicated issue, but I find it interesting. I mean, they have some of the worst censorship of the internet in the world. People aren't allowed to get a lot of the information that we're giving. They're still able to go on YouTube, they're still able to watch this video, but I mean, Wikipedia is banned among many others. Twitter has been off and on over the years. And I mean, obviously, that's a symptom of a government that realizes that people are waking up, and it doesn't matter. You could replace Erdogan. I'm not just picking on Erdogan here. You could replace Erdogan with another government. Well, what's going to happen? It's going to be another government that only benefits from the control of the masses. It just continues in a circle forever. And that's why individuals on the ground, Turkish people are amazing. They're very independent people. They have a history of greatness. And I think it's really important that the Turkish people realize their value and stand up for their value instead of looking for one government or the other to save them from the problems of government in the first place. Yeah, everyone says, oh, well, Erdogan attacks the central banks. He goes after the central banks. No, he goes after the central bank boss. It's still the same, though. You still are printing vast amounts of currency out of thin air, manipulating an economy, propping up nonsense, which makes everyone feel real good at the time. You know, ask anyone living in 2005, 2006 United States. You know, wow, everything's great. Everyone is doing well, and we got nice new cars and nice new roads and nice new bridges and nice new buildings. And how did that end up? How did that turn out? Not very well, because this is just basic economics. And again, you can look at this anywhere in the world. I think that something that I need to make clear here in this video is that watch who you're shaking hands with. You see them shaking hands with the Chinese. Well, it's just as bad, if not even worse, than shaking hands with the United States government. Either way, yeah, it looks good for now. You benefit in the short term, but they have ulterior motives up their sleeves, and they don't do it just for nothing. And they want to own you guys. They want to own the people in Turkey. And this is what's crazy, is that, you know, China and the United States and the IMF all do the same thing, trying to loan people money they know they can't pay back, and then they try to buy them up and buy up their resources and all that kind of stuff. And it's really brutal. But also I want to mention this Financial Times article that says Turkey has moved to curb selling pressure in its financial markets as investors recoiled at the country's offensive in Syria, and a decision by U.S. prosecutors to file criminal charges against one of the country's biggest banks. The Banking Regulations and Supervision Agency, BRSA, told local lenders earlier this week that it would like them to refrain from providing lira in the offshore currency swap market, according to three people familiar with the measures. Without those swaps, it is hard for international traders to bet that the lira will fall. John, what do you think of, finishing this off, the fate of Turkey, the fate of the lira, the fate of an economy that's so incredibly propped up? I mean, yeah, it looks great right now, and it looks like people are doing well, but it just seems like, again, you're just painting a picture that doesn't actually exist. You're painting a veneer over, a broken down, dilapidated old building.
Yeah, you totally do. And the problem is you're basically just fueling the economy with more and more debt, because you need more and more debt to prop it up, right? So what's interesting, though, is that Turkey, like we talked about the Turkish economy versus the Chinese economy, for example. Remember, like the Chinese economy grew 400, well, no, not really. So the debt grew 431% in China, which they've been building fake buildings to prop up that debt. And then you take a look at Turkey, they actually built buildings, but they're up 800-something%. So clearly, who has the biggest bubble in the world right now? I think Turkey is in for some serious problems. And with the lira, being down 83-something% right now in value over the last 16 years, that is an unsustainable path, Josh. And of course, we can keep on, printing currency. And of course, the great, what's his name, moron called Paul Krugman, he came out and said that debt is money we owe to ourselves. But I would ask Krugman, how much debt of that Turkish, private debt is owed to ourselves? No, it's owed to the banksters. You pathetic moron. It's people like Krugman is like the cancer of the earth that are pushing this policy out and like just murdering people around the world with this debt, that are committing suicide because they own too much debt. And then he's just coming around and said that, yeah, we can print as much money as we want. He's a buffoon. He's a pathetic moron. Sorry for name calling people here, but that kind of policy is, as I said, murdering people around the world, and have done for year thousands, since ever we printed, or even the base currency back in the Greek and the Greek and the Roman Empire.
Yeah, killing millions of people and impoverishing hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, exactly, Josh. And this has been a atrocity that have happened throughout so many thousands of years. And if you don't, let ourselves, get past that in Turkey, and I think they could, because from what I found there, Josh, I found some interesting stats from Statista. They actually did it's called the Statista Global Consumer Survey. So they, call random 1,000 people and asked them basic questions, and they were asking them some questions. Well, some of them were, if they actually either used or owned cryptocurrencies. And this backs upon their belief that we were talking about earlier, that there are some of the most tax evading people in the world, trying to, not be enslaved by the government. They actually also, 20% of the respondents, and that's the highest in the world of the G20 countries, which, had countries like Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, which is a competitor to, Turkey printing currency out of thin air. They were even still below Turkey. So Turkey, actually 20% have used it. And there's another stat that actually showed who actually owns, Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies right now in Turkey. And 18% of the respondents said that they actually owned currently cryptocurrencies. And this was in 2018 that these stats were, asked again out of Statista as well. And as you can see, there's I believe that the Turkish people have that individuality, that, they don't really like the government per se. And that's why you've seen, there's been mass outflows of Turks around the world, because they have tried to get away from, the oppressive government that you've seen in Turkey over so many years. And of course, we can't forget what Tayyip Erdogan wants to do. He wants to build an Ottoman Empire again. And the Ottoman Empire, was great over many years. Of course, any empire is a tyrannical, murderous outfit of the government. But again, like looking at, the Ottoman Empire, they actually, kept their purchasing power for decades, centuries. They, stayed in silver for so many years until the end of it, which is the late 1800s, 1900s, when they started to debase their currency heavily over that time. And then, of course, they went into a pure fiat currency in Turkey. And that has, seen that failure, fail miserably for the currency before.
Yeah.
They had the hyperinflations in Turkey before as well. So there's nothing new to people there, that, it's the government has been terribly to manage the minimum exchange. So they tried to mitigate that by, using gold. And as you can see, there's the government official holdings has almost gone up 3% in gold. And I'm pretty sure that the Turkish people also holds a little bit of gold, because they're part of that Middle Eastern belief of value. You got to remember, when the Chinese this was the Yuan dynasty. Interestingly enough, the current currency is named after that, which was the Great Khan, of course. They tried to put in a fiat currency in Turkey and in the Middle East. They actually burned actually rioted in the cities, just burnt these paper currencies coming in, because they believed in the fundamentals of the Ottomans, of course, believed in the fundamentals of real value. And that just shows you, Josh, that, I think there's some, for the Turkish lira itself, there's not too much of a future, Josh, but I think for the Turkish people, there might be a bright side of here, because you see a lot of them are aware of using things to mitigate themselves from the government, stranglehold.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I got a lot of comments on a lot of videos when I talk about countries like Turkey or anywhere in the world, and people get ideologically prone to defend their own ideology and their form of governance or slavery. And a lot of people would say, oh, why are you talking about Erdogan and all the bad things that he's doing? What about the U.S. government? And I'm like, yeah, exactly.
Look at some videos.
What about the Russian government? What about the Chinese government? Yeah, they're organized crime rackets. They do bad things because they are organized crime rackets. It doesn't matter. I'm not picking on your country country and picking on this idea of the state, of statism, of control over the populace. Collectivism begets collectivism. It is cancer, folks. It's always going to be cancer. You replace them, you get another form of cancer. You cut 95% of a tumor out and you still have 5% left. It's ridiculous. So it's not about Erdogan. It's about this idea of constantly enslaving the masses, thinking that you need government to come in and solve the problems of government that it created in the first place. And yeah, it looks great for the time being. You know, everything looks great and dandy, and you know, all fiat currencies eventually revert to zero. They always have, they always will, going back to 1024 AD in China. So this time isn't going to be any different, and the people in Turkey are going to suffer. And it's about time that people start standing up for themselves rather than a government or an ideology that's political and involves forcing your neighbor to do things that they don't wish to do. This is about you, folks. This is about you as an individual, freeing yourself, freeing your mind, decentralizing, and stop being a slave, a cattle on a farm for someone like Erdogan or Trump or Obama before him, or, you know, Putin or Xi Jinping or any of these people anywhere in the world to control. Stop being controlled, stop being a slave. And I see that a lot in Turkey. A lot of people are very independent. As you mentioned, the Bitcoin usership or user base in Turkey, I saw even in the big tourist centers, Bitcoin stores, right in the places where businesses have to pay the most money to have, to be able to set up their form of headquarters. I think it says a lot about being right by the Grand Bazaar, a huge tourist, some might say trap, in Istanbul, to see a massive Bitcoin store with the Bitcoin logo on the top. And I think it just says a lot about, you know, the direction people are going in, because people are naturally wanting to decentralize and stop being extorted. They'll say some things on the surface, but look, the problems I see in every country in the world always tend to be government. No matter where I go, no matter if it's a dictatorship or a democracy or a republic, it doesn't matter if it's a monarchy, any of that. It's always, always, always coming down to government being the problem. The people on the ground suffer the most, and the people on the ground are always good anywhere you go. Everywhere you go in the world, people are good. It's the state that creates problems and then comes in as a solution saying, look, you needed us all along. And here we are to come to the rescue. And we need to avoid that at all costs. Of course, as always, my solutions to this economic crisis, that's a worldwide issue and is affecting every country in the world right now. It's an everything bubble. It's a derivatives bubble. It's a housing bubble worldwide, pension bubbles, and currency bubbles. Everywhere you go in the world, the solutions are simple. Individual responsibility, self-sustainability, education, and food, water, shelter, self-defense. You're not gathering things for the toughest guy on the block. And of course, gold and silver as wealth insurance. This is my opinion, not investment advice, but it's not even an investment. This is about history here. Wealth insurance. It's meant as wealth insurance, not an investment. And of course, cryptocurrencies and blockchain infrastructure technology that's properly decentralized. Only like a small percentage of them are good, but that small percentage are changing the world forever. So do your own due diligence, folks, as always. And make sure to check those links below and check our outro video after this, because we need your help as we're getting shadow banned. Because we don't toe a line of one side or the other. We just talk about freedom and individual liberty and freeing yourselves from these slave masters that are trying to ravage humanity and make you more of a dependent slave all the time. We'll be back at you guys with much more. Thanks for going into all of this with us, John. There's so much to talk about. And of course, Turkey is a very complicated country to get into because there's a lot of deep-seated issues that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And obviously, you know, there's no way to properly break it down. Most people in Turkey can't properly break it down. That's why this has been going on so long. But it comes down to individuals breaking free from the ideologues that try to make you regurgitate their talking points over time and try to get you on one side or the other, because it's going to go on forever. Break free from it. Don't try to replace. Get rid of. You know, people wonder why, oh, well, we replace the person at the top of the chain, the face of the movement, or we replace the face on the civilization, but wait a second. Why is it still corrupted?
Why is it still doing the same thing?
Yeah, well, maybe
it's the same thing.
To do with get rid of the system, not the puppet that stands at the top of the system.
Yeah, it's the same as insanity. You know, why is the same thing doing the same thing again?
It's absolutely ridiculous, folks. Make sure to comment below what you think. I'm sure there's going to be a vast array of arguments and confliction, and the good people that actually watch the video all the way through. If you've reached this part of the video, I'm doing a little survey here. Write Apple in the comments. Just write Apple. Don't explain why. I want to see how many people actually watch the videos all the way through.
Anyway,
Anyway,
writing orange, Josh.
yeah. Anyway, I appreciate everyone watching today, and we'll be back with you guys with much more. Watch this outro video coming up right away. This is Josh Sigurdson and John Sneisen signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
Be the change.
Like what you see here at Wham, don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We cannot do it without you guys. Every donation is extremely, extremely appreciated as we're getting incredibly shadow banned. We've lost 80% of our audience since January of 2019 and counting. They are ripping us apart here on YouTube, and the only thing we could do in the meantime as we prepare for the next big step is to ask for help from the viewers that support our free information that we try to post on a daily basis. You can also find us on Subscribestar, where just $1 a month, that's all it takes, $1 a month is all it takes to truly make a huge difference. If everyone gave $1 a month, it would change everything for independent media, and we could win this information war, and we can defeat the mainstream medias eventually. And of course, on Subscribestar, we post subscriber-only content that you'll only see on Subscribestar. So make sure to pledge there, become a patron. That makes a huge difference, guys. And also, don't forget to check out our Bitcoin address below in the comments and description, as well as on the screen for you to scan if you please. And also, don't forget to subscribe to us on the alternatives. We will likely be deleted by YouTube in the next 2 years. It's already happening on a vast scale, so make sure to find us on float.app. That's flote.app. At Josh Sigurdson, as well as at Wham, W-A-M. Float.app is replacing every social media, and I mean, it's just incredible the opportunities it provides for not just creators, but for the average person who wants to get away from these nannies telling them what they can or cannot see. They plan to replace Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, Tumblr, Reddit, and Patreon. You could subscribe to us on Float and pledge with cryptocurrency. It's really innovative. We are also on BitChute at World Alternative Media, as well as so many others, Minds, PocketNet. You can find us at World Alternative Media on Instagram. There's many options. And finally, don't forget to join us at Anarchapulco 2020, the famous event, the best liberty event known to mankind, other than perhaps Anarcho Vegas 2020. There are 2 major events coming up that we are extremely excited about, and you can use promo code WHAM, that's W-A-M, and save 10% on your tickets to these legendary conferences. There's so many amazing people speaking there. You won't want to miss it. So make sure to support in any way you can, even if it's just sharing our videos, pressing like, pressing to be notified. Anything helps, folks. You are the change you wish to see. Thanks for watching, everyone. And until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
I'm sure you have already changed people's minds in your young age because you're involved, and I like that.
Wow.